Hello, my name is Matthew Jackson, and today I want to talk to you about the law and grace. I've been an evangelical Christian for 34 years now, and one of the trends I've noticed among us evangelicals is we tend to emphasize the grace and the New Testament side of Christianity, when we tend to de-emphasize and ignore the law in the Old Testament side of Christianity. In my next few minutes in my talk, what I want to do is I want to bring some balance and perspective on this issue. There's been times when I've gotten in debates with fellow believers and I would cite an Old Testament scripture to prove my point. And they'd say, oh, well, that's in the Old Testament, give me a New Testament scripture. And, I say, listen, the Bible is the Bible, Scripture is Scripture. And let me read you a scripture that Paul wrote to Timothy. It says in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work. Now, the significance of that scripture is not just the scripture itself, but when the scripture was written, okay? Because at the time Paul wrote that scripture, the New Testament as we know it did not exist at that time. The New Testament as we know it did not come into full fruition until the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. So for the first 325 years of Christianity, the only thing we had was the Old Testament. That was all Scripture at the time. So when Paul was talking about that, he was talking specifically about the Old Testament. Jesus himself, concerning the law, he said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill them. This is in Matthew 5:17. So Jesus is talking about fulfillment. He actually uses the law. In Matthew 4, when he's tempted by the devil, he oftentimes, on three occasions when the devil tempted him, the first things that came out of his mouth was, "It is written." Okay? When he said, "It is written," he's talking about the law. He used the law to resist the devil. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus healed a man with leprosy. Afterwards, he upheld the Mosaic law governing public health. And he said in Matthew 8:4, see that you don't tell anybody, but go show yourself to the priests and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. He was upholding the public health code when he said that. Okay? So now we move on to John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. This is another area where Jesus upheld the law. Jesus actually upheld the Mosaic criminal code for executing capital offenders. After a woman who was caught in adultery and brought to him, he said, if any of you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. I think this particular passage of Scripture is probably one of the most quoted out of context scriptures that I've heard in my Christian walk, alongside of judge not lest you be judged. Those two scriptures, those of you without sin, cast the first stone, judge not lest you be judged. People misinterpret those scriptures as Jesus making a prohibition against judging. How many times have you held somebody accountable for their bad behavior and they come back and say, well, judge not lest you be judged, or if you haven't sinned, throw the first stone. Okay? Well, that's not what this scripture is about. The reason Jesus said what he said was because he understood the procedure for executing capital offenders under Jewish law. The Mosaic justice system the task of actually carrying out a capital sentence was left up to the common citizenry. In most civil situations, usually it's a civil authority that carries out a capital punishment execution. The Hebrew culture is the only culture in the world where the citizenry participates in the process. The eyewitnesses who brought the charges were the ones who were expected to throw the first stones when carrying out an execution by stoning. Then the rest of the citizenry who were present would subsequently throw theirs. In Deuteronomy 17:7, it says, "The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting him to death, then the hands of all the people." So you see the connection this has to the story in John chapter 8. Contrary to popular belief, Jesus was not making a prohibition against judgment, as I earlier said. Jesus knew the motives of those bringing charges against the woman. The fact that the man whom the woman was committing adultery with was not there, should be equally held accountable, proves that the accusers were not interested. They were more interested in entrapping Jesus. They were not really honest inquirers. When Jesus said, "If any of you is without sin, let him be first to cast the stone." The passage went on to say, "And those who heard began to throw away or drop their stones one at a time, the older ones first, until only the woman and Jesus was standing there." This is really interesting because under the Mosaic Criminal Code, in order for you to throw a stone at the offender, the one who was charged, you yourself had to be innocent of the charge that that person was being accused of. The reason they dropped their stones was because they themselves were adulterers. They were guilty of that sin that they were accusing the woman of. In verse 10 and 11, Jesus went on to ask the woman, "Where are your accusers?" After stating that she did not have any, he told her that he had no grounds to condemn her either. The Mosaic Criminal Code also stipulates that there has to be a minimum of 2 eyewitnesses to carry out a death sentence. We learn this in Numbers 35:30. Anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of witnesses, plural tense. But no one is to be put to death on the testimony of one witness. That's Numbers 35:30. And then in Deuteronomy 17:6 it says, "On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses a man shall be put to death, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only one witness." So we have 2 Old Testament scriptures validating the event and how Jesus handled that situation. Even though Jesus had no legal grounds to have the woman executed due to a lack of witnesses, he still admonished her. He said, "Go and leave your life of sin." That does not sound like a neutral, non-judgmental comment to me. So he was still holding her accountable for her bad behavior, but he held up the Mosaic Criminal Code at the same time. These examples that I gave clearly indicate that Jesus had an excellent practical working knowledge of the Bible. Thank you. This concludes my time.